free to put them in the chat. So the panelists today are Brooke Hudspeth, who is our Chief Practice Officer, and she is helping with the rollout of the COVID vaccine in our college and at the University of Kentucky and across the state. So we are lucky to have her. Then we have Dr. Clark Thibodeau, who is a Clinical Associate Professor of Pharmacy Practice and Science. He's also the director of our community-based residency program. And Dr. Vince Venditto, who is a PhD and received training in organic synthesis and vaccine development. And Clark and Vince are now working on a clinical trial with community pharmacies to understand the prevalence of SARS-CoV-2 in Kentucky. So knowing that background, basically any questions are up for grabs. You can chat them to me directly, or you can put them open for everyone. And I have some prepared questions that we'll go through if no one has any that they want to put in there. And then also, we're going to deal with vaccine information first, and then towards the end, we'll get to the college rollout, but so that no one has to wait, because I know this is a question that keeps coming up and that Kip will talk about later, but the college does not actually decide who gets the vaccine when. So as far as we can tell, faculty, students, and some staff are beginning to get the invite to receive their vaccination. And we're working on getting answers in terms of the distribution. So if that's why you logged on, I wanted to make sure you got the info right away. So let's start with Vince. Vince, what would you say to someone who's worried about the vaccine being rushed?
Yeah, so I think with all vaccines and therapies that have been approved, and certainly with these vaccines, they all go through the very similar process where they have preclinical studies, clinical studies, and there's manufacturing along the way. So while the timeline was shortened here because there were a lot of concurrent steps happening, none of those steps proceeded without making sure that the safety was validated by the safety monitoring boards, which are independent of the pharmaceutical companies. And so the phase 1 trials went through to evaluate safety all the way to phase 3. And it was at that point that the FDA determined that they were safe. So I think really the fact that this was such a quick rollout is actually a testament to the science and the investment up front from the federal government and others to really get this rolled out in a year effectively.
So can you talk a little bit about the technology and the safety of the vaccine?
Yeah, sure. So the technology is basically a lipid formulation. So similar to lipids we might find in our foods. These are proprietary, so the companies have patents on them. And then they mix those with genetic material. And that combination of the lipids with the genetic material, when injected into your arm, are taken up by cells. And so that mRNA, the genetic material that's in the vaccine, holds the code for the proteins that are expressed on the virus. So you're not actually getting the virus, you're getting just a piece of the virus. And that's what we mount an immune response to. And so our cells are making those proteins to induce that immune response. Yeah.
So you mentioned the mRNA. So we know that doesn't affect our genetics or DNA. Can you talk about why?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is mRNA cannot get into our cell's genome. And so it's not going to insert itself into the DNA. There's not really a way for the mRNA to do that as part of the vaccine. And so what our cells do is they use the mRNA to make those proteins. And then once the cells have made the proteins, they've used the mRNA, everything is basically destroyed and eliminated. So there's no long-lasting effects of the vaccine other than the immune response that's induced to protect us from being hospitalized.
So Clark, I'm going to switch over to you. So Vince has talked a little bit about what's in the vaccine. Do we know exactly what's in the vaccine?
We do. As Vince said, it contains that mRNA component, the kind of that blueprint, if you will, of making the protein that produces that immune response. That's consistent between both vaccines. As Vince mentioned, the kind of lipid layer, kind of like cholesterol, is similar between the both, but proprietary. And some of the salts and buffers are slightly different between the two vaccines, but everyone could be consistent that these two vaccines ultimately produce similar results.
So no microchip then?
No. It's funny. I don't know if any of you all have heard this from friends, family, or maybe the deep recesses of Facebook, but actually had a resident once where this happened to one of our community residents. And for if any students are on the call, they know we talk a lot about motivational interviewing and patient-centered communication. We had just had this topic discussion, and an individual came in for an influenza vaccine, and they were sitting down for like maybe like an MTM or other counseling to ask about the flu shot. And he goes, I'm not doing any government tracking. I'm not into that at all. And I was so proud that, my reaction, as most of us on the inside, you hear something like that and it's almost confrontational, in fact, but the resident actually listened and kind of explored what that wasn't judgmental at all, and asked just to expand a little bit more where they heard that. And ultimately, what happened was the resident showed them the vaccine itself, made it very apparent that nothing like that could happen. And believe it or not, that patient got the vaccine that day. So I'm sure many of you all, as you all are helping with the vaccine rollout, hopefully don't encounter that barrier too often, but in some cases too, it is possible to overcome and help patients get vaccinated.
Thanks, Clark. So Brooke, since you're also helping with the rollout of the vaccine, what would you say to someone who doesn't want to get it or is very hesitant to get it?
Yeah, so we understand that some people may be concerned about getting vaccinated now that the COVID-19 vaccines are available in the United States. And I'm sure many of us have had those conversations. I know that I have personally. So I think first and foremost, the question that you launched us off with, and that Vince, the information that Vince has shared regarding the safety, I think that's important to be able to relay and communicate with your patients or with those who are asking or showing that concern that although these vaccines were developed quickly, that safety remained a top priority in the development of these vaccines. So I think that's the first thing to really reassure those individuals that this is safe. And then I also like to talk about the benefits and the reasons why someone might want to get a vaccine. So first, we know that it can help protect you from getting COVID-19. And so sometimes there's a question of, well, I'm healthy, I'll be okay if I get it. But really, another thing I like to think about too is that you're also protecting others and those that are around you. So not only do we know that these vaccines are safe, we also know that in order for them to go through that process, that they also have to show that they are effective. And both of the vaccines that we do have available were shown to be highly effective. But again, that's not just for yourself, but it's also for those that are around you. And then I think the second thing to really think about is that we know that immunizations are a safe way to provide that protection. And so, we also sometimes hear that, well, I've been infected, or I'll just get infected and I'll build immunity that way. But I think with the vaccine, we know that is a safe way to provide that immunity. With COVID-19, different people can have different responses or outcomes that can impact people differently. And some of those ways can be pretty severe. So we know through these approval process that these vaccines are safe and that they're effective. And then I think thirdly, really just thinking about that this is one of the tools that we now have available to help put an end to this pandemic. So we know about masking and hand washing and social distancing and all of those efforts and tools that we have available. But really, that's not going to be enough. This is a really valuable tool that we have to really play a part in helping to put an end, or at least get back to some type of normal and quality of life.
And so That was a great answer. Thank you. Yeah, all the questions that I had in between. Can you talk about what the side effects might be if you do decide to get the vaccine?
Yeah, so I think side effects are going to maybe be seen, to likely be seen. Really, it is a normal sign that your body is building that protection. So just as with other vaccines, really common ones that you may see are just some pain or swelling or redness at the injection site. Um, some of the others that may be less localized, things like just overall feelings of being tired or having a headache, feeling just fatigued, maybe even a fever. Again, that is a sign that your immune system is doing what it's supposed to. So those are our symptoms, but they should go away. If patients do experience something that is more severe or more ongoing, that is when we would want to document that to continue to ensure the safety measures in place for the vaccine.
So I want to follow up on that. I think so. I received the vaccine yesterday. I was lucky enough to get called on the list, and my arm was pretty sore last night. It was pretty sore when I woke up this morning. It felt like I was maybe punched in the arm. But right now it's I guess 26 hours later. I really don't have any pain or any residual effects. And as Brooke pointed out, that is your immune system working. So that is exactly what I want to happen when I get my vaccine.
Brooke, I've heard something where after the second shot, people are having more severe side effects. Is that the case that you're finding, or?
That is, they do indicate that some of those side effects that you see may be more, they may be more pronounced after the second vaccine. I think that was seen in some of those clinical trials. I've not personally heard that overwhelming response from patients who I have seen and that have received the vaccine, but I know that is some data that's out there. But again, I think that just goes back to knowing that is your immune system working, right? That's what we want it to see. We know that, and we're building that immunity, we're building that response. And so that is something that can be seen. But again, it shouldn't deter someone from coming back to get that second dose. It's very important that individuals understand that it's important to complete that series and to get both of those doses.
And Clark or Brooke, how long does the vaccine last? So we need to get it every year, like the flu shot, or yeah.
So as I think you kind of alluded in the introduction a little bit, we're seeing this unfold in real time. So I kind of like to think of it in two buckets: what we know and what we don't know. We know that the vaccine is effective. It was tested right for if a patient was positive 2 weeks after the second dose. The efficacy data was stronger than even some of the initial FDA estimates, right, to qualify for an emergency use approval of the vaccine, which is a positive development. There was a really interesting article that was released in Science earlier this week that talked about the potential endemic nature. And some of the things that impact that is how many people that get the vaccine. So the current recommendation is that everyone gets 2 doses of either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine is currently approved. And the higher that number goes, the more likely or the less severe potentially the endemic nature of the virus. The one thing I'd like to add to Vincent and Brooke had mentioned that the CDC has a vSafe app. Many of you might have seen this if you've already been vaccinated. It's almost like kind of crowdsourced clinical trial in a way, if you will. So we have VAERS historically, which is if you do have a side effect, there's been a historical reporting system through the CDC called VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. But specifically to COVID, there's something called the vSafe app, and I'd encourage you all to download. And if you do have that shoulder pain or no response, there's a way to report that so the CDC can better monitor that in the FDA in real time.
And can you also talk about, so if you get the vaccine, get both, or if you get both shots of one vaccine, I should say, can you still spread COVID even if you may not have the severe symptoms that would put you in the hospital?
Yeah, so the vaccine series and 2 weeks later isn't a permission slip to throw off the mask or run out or go that. What we know is that there was less severity of disease in those who completed the vaccination series and were less likely to test positive at that point. So when we talk about what we know and don't know, ultimately, the more people that get vaccinated, the less severe the course of disease. And as you know, we're focusing on adults, and I know we're going to get into prioritization and talking about the vaccine rollout itself. But I'd encourage even those that get the vaccine to continue to follow social distancing guidelines, wearing masks, due to the unknown. And that way too, that we protect the most people. And as we continue the vaccine rollout, it's we don't know the finish line necessarily, but I think it's important, particularly as you've completed the series, that you still continue to take those precautions.
Vince, a follow-up on that. So if you have been infected and then chose to get the vaccine, would you be better protected?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think we don't have a clear answer. Right now, what the recommendation is from the FDA is that regardless of whether you were infected or not, that you get the vaccine. We know the data from the vaccine, and we know the level of immunity that is induced, and it's robust, and we know, at least for the number of months that they've been tracking these patients now, that it is persistent. The response to the virus, if you're infected, is a little bit more variable, and so it's not clear if you have protective immunity. So that's why it's important to get the vaccine. Now, if you get the vaccine and infection, is it better? I don't think that we have data for that. I think the best chance for protection, though, really is to get the vaccine.
So to any of the panelists, if you get the vaccine today, is there a chance that on a COVID test, you'll show positive within the next few days?
Always asking the tough questions, Chris.
Oh yeah, no. It on a viral test, no. So if you were to get the vaccine today and then go to, Wild Health, you would not test positive on a viral base unless you were previously infected. So that's the tricky part here, is that if you say, one thing I would caution everyone as you guys are watching, you guys are going to see a lot of articles, even in respected news media, that often talks about one person gets COVID-19 1 week after getting vaccine. You have to remember the context that because of the lag period between infection and when somebody might become positive, it's possible that if you were to test positive, it's likely you were infected prior to that vaccine dose.
Okay. That's helpful.
Now, I should add, Chris, I'm sorry, that you will test positive on an antibody test over time. So I should make that clear. On serology tests, 2 weeks after your second vaccination, it's likely you've produced some sort of antibody response. But on a viral test, it actually requires the virus, not what's in the vaccine.
So there's been some questions about if this vaccine is effective with the new variants that are there. And I've had conversations with Vince about whether it should be called variants or strains. So 2 questions for you, Vince. What's the difference between a variant and a strain? And how concerned should we be that we're seeing these different variants happening worldwide?
Yeah, so, the difference between variant and strain is, I think, all over the place in the literature. And if you talk to certain virologists, I think they're very careful in how they use variant and how they use strain. And I think Vincent Racaniello, who is the host of a podcast called This Week in Virology, is a very strong proponent for making that differentiation. So variant is basically just any mutation that occurs in the virus. And this happens all the time. It's very common for viruses to have mutations. It's part of their viral evolution. And what he pushes as a strain is, and what is, I think, pushed by a lot of virologists, is that a strain has mutations that lead to different biological properties. And so it is very common to have a variance in viruses, but whether or not they have different biological properties and whether or not they have different disease severity is really what the difference is. So when we think about the different variants that are coming out now, I think, we don't necessarily have all the data we need to know if they are actually fully, if we can make that differentiation between a variant and a strain, because there's a lot of public health and epidemiology that goes into these discussions, and the data is being collected. But what I can say is, based on everything we know right now with this strain or variant that's been identified in England, and now we found it in the US, is that the vaccine appears to work against this variant. And so it looks like if you get the vaccine, you will still be protected. It is very possible that the virus continues to mutate and we have other variants, and that may require vaccination again in the future with a slightly different vaccine. But obviously, this is an evolving pandemic. It's an evolving situation. And I think it's only, it requires a lot more science and a lot more evaluation to track what's actually going to happen in the future.
Vince, can I ask you a question here?
Sure.
I read a lot about people who got COVID-19, and there was an Oxford study. They proposed, or they showed actually, that the antibodies were still there in a big titer 6 or 7 months after the infection. And they kind of proposed or tried to kind of guess how long it would work. And they came up to the conclusion it would last at least for a year. How long do you think the protection from the vaccine will last?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's a tough question to answer because we don't have the data, right? So I think the one thing we know is that we're seeing antibodies in subjects that were immunized during the clinical trials. And so we're still seeing those antibodies. The antibody levels are going down, and that is expected. So when you induce an immune response, you don't want to have antibodies floating around in your blood forever. You want your, we call it immune memory. And we want your immune memory cells to be ready to respond so that you don't need to constantly have those antibodies floating around. So, the short answer is we don't know right now. The patients that were immunized, I guess close to a year ago now, still have antibodies. So it looks like a year is reasonable to consider, but we don't know how long it's actually going to last. And really, once we have a memory response, if we're reinfected, those memory cells are re-stimulated, and then your antibody levels should go back up to what it looked like immediately after vaccination.
So we got this question actually today from PR, which was whether or not this vaccine, either Moderna or Pfizer, affects fertility. Vince, you want to take that one?
Sure. So I received this question this morning, as Christy indicated, and I did a little reading. And so there is some evidence that the SARS-CoV-2, the virus, can be found in semen, and that it affects sperm, that it can affect sperm production. Now, the data here is limited. I don't think we should be drawing any conclusions, but there may be some evidence that infection with the virus can lead to effects in sperm production. Now, so does the virus lead to infertility? I would actually say the opposite, that the virus, or does the vaccine lead to infertility? I would say the opposite. The vaccine can prevent infertility if the virus is actually causing that. So if you get vaccinated, there is potential for reduced side effects as indicated in the clinical trials. Now, obviously, as I'm going to say, I think probably for every single one of my answers, that we need a lot more data. We need a lot more science to determine all these things. None of this is really fully understood right now, but there are some reports of these things. So to come back to your question, the vaccine is not going to cause infertility.
So I might want to add a little bit to Vince's original answer too on the length of expected duration of effect. We know two other things. We know that symptomatic cases of reinfection are extraordinarily rare. There have been a couple of large studies on this. They're less than 0.1% in populations that were seropositive for initial infection. And that appears to extend out at least 8 months, which is how long we have data. That's the total course of the actual epidemic. And we know that we see memory B and T cells on the same time scale. So the memory effect Vince just referred seems quite likely to occur post-vaccination. Now, what we don't know is whether or not there are asymptomatic cases of reinfection, or indeed yet really whether there are asymptomatic cases post-vaccination. So I think we all ought to not assume that being vaccinated means that we cannot transmit until we have proof that that is the case, which will take another year.
And for those wondering who Kip is, who might be on YouTube, this is the dean of our college who has a background in infectious disease. So thanks, Kip, that was helpful. Clark, when we're talking about safety and who should get the vaccine, do we have any data? Do we have any data on pregnant women or people who are pregnant or children?
Yeah, so there's a few different groups, and I know we've got questions. I mean, as far as pregnancy goes, getting COVID-19 while pregnant is a higher risk for hospitalization and what we would consider severe COVID-19. So in general, patients who are pregnant are recommended to get the vaccine. They didn't fall as much in a prioritization group. You know, the benefit to the baby is similar to other vaccines, right? And then protecting the mom also protects the baby. For those asking about, we don't have a ton of data on vaccines in pregnancy because it was a exclusion criteria for the initial trials for the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. But there were about 24 pregnancies that occurred after the first dose. And there were, I think, maybe a dozen that got the vaccine and a dozen that got the placebo. There were no adverse events in those 24 individuals. There was a miscarriage, but it occurred in the placebo group, not the vaccine group. So from what we do have in pregnancy, and then of course, when we talk about reporting in the VSafe app, so two other things, immunosuppression, it's patients who are immunosuppressed, same thing, might have worse outcomes from COVID-19 because of the mechanism. It's likely to, produce a better immune response than what we talk about with natural infection. And then the one thing I would say to those who are immunosuppressed is that they should continue with a focus on stringent prevention measures until we can be more sure about the transmission issue that we were talking about before, just to ensure the risk of infection. And then children, the trial in Pfizer was 16 and older, Moderna was 18. Both of those companies, upon EUA approval, started trials in children. But the next vaccine that we will see most likely approved is still tested in adults. And it's just simply a case of where the more adverse outcomes of COVID-19 are. So the initial few next months will be focused on adult immunization. And then as we get into the summer months and rolling out, it's going to see how endemic it is and how infections in the course in children may or may not get vaccination next.
So you talked about immunocompromised people. Are there any pre-existing health conditions, chronic disease, allergies that would contraindicate the vaccine?
Yeah, so if the main contraindication to a second dose of a vaccine would be a reaction to the COVID-19 vaccine. Patients who have had a history of anaphylaxis to any vaccine component in the past may still be able to get the vaccine, but if they do, they should do it in a healthcare system that can triage appropriately for a potential anaphylactic reaction. There are a couple situations where you may be observed a little bit longer, maybe a 30-minute window instead of the traditional 15-minute window. But in general, it's all clinical decisions regarding immunization are risk-benefit scenario, and the benefit is very high, and so it's balancing how to best manage the risk for those immunocompromised, pregnancy, a lot of those different pre-existing conditions. There were patients who had HIV included in the trials, but their CD4 counts were controlled. They were virally suppressed. It wasn't they weren't considered immunocompromised in the same fashion as what we call severe immunosuppression.
So along with the allergies, I'll punt this one to Brooke, but should people with egg-based allergies get the vaccine?
Yes. So both the Pfizer and the Moderna are not contraindicated. So they are not made in those egg-based facilities like some of the other vaccines where that is a concern. So that is not a contraindication to either available.
And if you have a choice between Moderna and Pfizer, is one better than the other?
So they're effectively the same thing. I mean, the technology is all the same for both Pfizer and Moderna. So really, I would just select the location that has a vaccine when your time comes, and go get whatever one is available.
And I'll add, if you start with one type of vaccine, it's not interchangeable. You should finish with that same vaccine dose. So it's really the other thing. If you're actively immunizing right now, make sure not only are you're required to give the CDC card of COVID-19 vaccination, but I tell the patient to take a picture with their phone right then and there in case they lose it.
Yeah. And one more question that I've been getting along those lines is if you received at one location, so not only just that type of vaccine, but it's also preferred that you go back to that same location to get your second dose. I know that question has arisen with some of UK Healthcare's efforts if people are wanting to come for their second vaccine, but what they are recommending right now is that you try to go back to that original location where you got that, or provider where you got that first dose.
All right, Brooke, I'll ask you this next question. So is UK or the College of Pharmacy doing anything specific around vaccine education targeting those populations that may have been disenfranchised by the healthcare system, Black people, African-American, Latinx, et cetera? What are some things we can do ourselves to support that?
Yeah, so we, from the College of Pharmacy perspective that I'm aware, we haven't actively developed any of that education. I know we have a smaller group of us that are looking at an opportunity for to address vaccine hesitancy, uptake, and implementation among populations that experience those health disparities. So that's something that's certainly on our radar. I know I've been, in some conversations where clearly those groups that you just mentioned, there is specific effort being placed on forming those educational tools and working with those healthcare providers to deliver that education to those patients. And so it's certainly top of mind in areas where we are focusing and certainly a very important consideration.
Thanks, Brooke. This question is for any of the panelists. So if you have a history of anaphylactic reactions to medicines in general, what recommendation would you give for the vaccine?
I'm going to let the pharmacist take it.
Yeah. I saw a question too in the chat that I think is kind of answered in the same question. The one group where the risk is higher than benefit is if there's a known anaphylactic reaction to one of the components of the vaccine. And that will most likely occur with the first dose, right? So if somebody were to get the dose and have a reaction, that would be a situation where the risk exceeds the benefit. Elsewhere, most of the situations when it comes to having a history of anaphylaxis is, like I mentioned earlier, making sure it's done in a situation where a patient could receive adequate treatment. So you're talking, hospital, emergency department, ways where they could receive adequate and quick treatment.
Thanks, Clark. I'm going to go back to Kip. I missed this because he's not on my screen that I can see. Kip, did you have anything to add to the vaccine education question?
I was just going to amplify a little on what Brooke said, and this has been rapidly evolving. So I think I'm actually going to be informing Brooke of the latest change here on the call. So as of this morning, we've been in touch with the mayor's office and are now being looped in with the community groups representing a number of the underrepresented or health disparity groups in the area, including Black, Latinx, and we're attempting outreach to Indigenous peoples as well. And right now we're in a needs assessment period where we will be meeting with the leaders of those groups, trying to understand what they need, whether that's issues with hesitancy, access, actual physical vaccination sites, and so on. But we will be doing that, and presuming that there are needs, I think you can all count on Brooke, anyone who's involved in the college, asking you for your help in addressing those needs as we develop that plan. And that'll be led by Brooke and Trinica Mitchell.
Thanks. That's helpful. And all new info. So in terms of vaccine access, let's see, I'll ask Clark this. How does the general public find out where they are in the priority line? Like, how do you get a vaccine? How do you go about that process in Kentucky, assuming you're not part of the UK healthcare system?
Yeah, so I think if I had that magic answer for everybody too, that would solve a lot of issues. So we're at the point now where a number of vaccine was delivered. It has not all been administered. They're continuing to manufacture more, and we're at probably over the next 2 to 4 weeks the most critical bottleneck of what we hope to believe the most critical bottleneck of vaccine distribution and administration. So a lot of vaccine was distributed. It was not all administered. And there's been a lot that's happening on both an individual state level and the federal level that at times felt somewhat in conflict. States, what you might read on the news or something might say one thing about a certain state versus another. And the initial roll, it allowed that flexibility at the state level. So what I'd say for folks in Kentucky is to go to, I think it's COVID-19 at ky.gov. Christy, I think, mentioned she could put it in the chat. Just to know where we are. Governor Beshear continues to provide updates. There's a listserv that talks about from a state perspective where they are. And then the most thing I could tell individuals is to make sure that you stay in contact with your be it primary care medical provider. We're not at the point right now where community pharmacies have ubiquitous access to the vaccine, similar to like the beginning of an influenza season, for example. But that may continue to happen over the next 2 to 4 months. So it'll be a rapidly evolving situation. And I don't know, Brooke, I'd maybe toss it to you if you want to add a little bit on top of that too.
Yeah, I think you covered it, Clark. I think we're at the point right now where we're in those earlier phases. And so the distribution from a state level, again, that, there are that overarching guidance, but then it's up to each state to really determine what that rollout looks like. And right now where we are in Kentucky, it's more of a focus on that state plan that really emphasizes working with the departments of public health. And as you guys may or may not be aware, we've had some opportunities with our students and faculty alike to start to be involved in those efforts. And then also with the health systems, which is what you're probably a little bit more familiar with from the UK healthcare side and some of the efforts that they are doing. So right now it's really that goal to try to get as many individuals immunized in those early phases as possible, and with the request of getting 90% of those doses administered within 7 days of receiving those at those different avenues. I know our community pharmacy partners are very eager to get on board. Many of our community pharmacies have been in preparation. In fact, I think we have over 800 pharmacies, and that's not really including those efforts that are being led in large part by pharmacists within those health systems, but those are pharmacies that are on board to be a federal pharmacy partner, and they've been actively getting ready to be able to administer that vaccine. And so I think as we roll in over the next couple of weeks, I think that's when we'll start to get some more of those details and looking at some of those other phases in a more, I guess, a wider approach to distribution and rolling on from those mass vaccine clinics that we're seeing right now.
All right, I'm gonna go with one more question from the chat, and then we'll move to more UK or College of Pharmacy specific rollout questions. But is this vaccine effort a real opportunity for yes. Is this vaccine effort a real opportunity for pharmacists to demonstrate the value of pharmacists as healthcare provider in relation to provider status? Could the panel comment?
Yes, I would say that it is. I think this is an opportunity that our pharmacists have, where we really have the ability to demonstrate, and we've seen our pharmacists really step up to this challenge, to be able to play a large part in these efforts. And so I think the value of a pharmacist is established now with their role in public health in terms of immunizations. And over the last several years, we've really seen pharmacies step up to have a major role with that significant public health initiative. And so I think this is just an added opportunity really for our pharmacists, our profession, to demonstrate our access and ability to have that role on the healthcare team.
Thank you.
Can I, if I could add to it real quick, the closest correlator we have, right, was we saw a lot of positive direction and policy from the H1N1 or, influenza about 10 years ago. Pharmacy's gone from that to administering, nearly a third of the influenza vaccines in the country. So part of it's a supply issue, but I really, I think pharmacists are going to play a significant role in ultimately not only this initial rollout, but the hard work of getting from 40 to 60%, from 60 to 70, and I think that's where we continue to stand ready from an access standpoint, from a relationship standpoint, communication too. So I am excited for the opportunity that's in front of us there.
And so to all the panelists, I feel like we've already had a spoiler from Vince, but knowing what you know now, or would you get the vaccine? I feel
Yes.
I'll get my second one too.
Okay, so we're going to switch now to talking to more internal UK rollout stuff. So if you were here for vaccine info, you feel free to pop off.